Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah, we are starting with the last session of today's symposium on oculoplasty, which is on orbit. The chairman for this session is Dr. Usha Kim, who needs no introduction. She is the head of the oculoplasty department at.
Swati ma'am, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Dr. Usha Kim, who is heading the department of oculoplasty in Arvind Eye Hospital. Then Dr. Dave, she is the convener for this session, who is the head of the orbit services at LV Prasad Eye Hospital. And Dr. Sauri Desai, who is the co-convener, who is heading the department of plastic in PD Hinduja Eye Hospital. We regret to say that Rabindra Mohan, who is the co-chairman for this session, is not joining because of demise of his mother. And our condolences are with him. I request Dr. Kim to say a few words and take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful meeting and so well organized with all the areas of interest put in place. So thank you, BOA and Dr. Sumit and Santosh in particular. Both of you have done an excellent work in putting together all these topics. And I think it's of great relevance today. And all of you stay safe. Everybody is being attacked left, right, and center. Let's all be healthy and stay safe. Prayers for everybody and wishes to all. So let's start off the session. Over to you.
So the first speaker for today is Dr. Raksha Rao, and she will be talking on orbital imaging, how and what to request in this orbit section. Dr. Raksha Rao has done her fellowship with Dr. Santosh now at Center for Sight, then at the Wills Eye Institute, and then at present she is working in Narayan Nethralaya as consultant. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sumit. So I'll be starting on orbital imaging, how and what to request. So of all the imaging modalities that is currently available for imaging orbit, the utility of radiography is very limited. While CT scan is the most widely used diagnostic modality, the usefulness of MRI, DSA, and ultrasonography for the identification, diagnosis, and monitoring of an orbital lesion is very, very important. In certain situations, there is no gray area as to what modality will you prefer. For example, in this patient with a history of cylinder blast injury, where you are expecting an intraorbital metallic foreign body, an MRI is absolutely contraindicated. A CT scan will not only confirm the diagnosis of a metallic foreign body, but an axial, coronal, and a sagittal section will determine the exact location of the foreign body, and that is exactly how you order for a CT scan, an axial coronal 2 mm cuts with a sagittal reconstruction. In cases of traumatic optic neuropathy, you would prefer asking the radiologist for 1 mm cuts because you need to see any bony fragment or soft tissue impingement in the orbital apex that is compressing on the optic nerve. While you deal with cases of orbital fracture, along with this regular CT cuts, you also ask for a bony window, which highlights the bony details, and also for a 3D reconstruction, which provides an overview of the bony pathology that can simulate an intra-op finding. A 3D reconstruction is also useful in studying shallow orbit and its implication on the orbital tissues. For example, in developmental anomalies, as in this case of craniosynostosis. However, in such cases, you also request for an MRI to study the health of the optic nerve. CT orbit is also useful in determination of all sorts of all cases of shallow orbit. For example, this case of osteopetrosis, where the CT orbit shows increased orbital bony mass. In all cases of orbital masses, a CT orbit is requested along with contrast. For example, this elderly lady who presented with periorbital edema, the CT an irregular mass within the orbit. On contrast, there is appearance of dilated superior ophthalmic vein, with which we can conclude the diagnosis that this particular orbital lesion is an arteriovenous malformation, and a sudden thrombosis within this orbital mass has led to the current picture. So while CT is the workhorse of the orbit, an MRI is a problem-solving technique. This young lady who presented with mild periorbital edema, the CT scan showed a punched out lesion within the bone and a surrounding inflammation as is seen by this fat stranding. Provisional diagnosis of a ruptured dermoid was made. However, due to atypical presentation, an MRI was ordered, and an MRI on T2 showed the lesion to be hypointense, which is not consistent with how a fat-containing dermoid lesion would look. So the lesion was second guessed to be an eosinophilic granuloma, which was later confirmed on histopathology. An MRI is also very useful in evaluating any orbital lesion which is multispatial and irregular, like a lymphangioma, where a CT orbit shows a very irregular mass lesion, and an MRI characterizes the lesion very well with this fluid level, which is pathognomic of an orbital lymphangioma. MRI orbit is very useful in thyroid eye disease because it not only shows enlarged extraocular muscles with the typical tendon sparing, but it also shows hyperintense edematous muscle in an active disease, which is very useful in disease monitoring and treatment. MRI orbit is the diagnostic modality of choice in ocular and orbital retinoblastoma because it can diagnose subtle NVI, subtle optic nerve involvement, the scleral breach and orbital extension, extensive optic nerve involvement that can include and extend into the chiasma, causing a suprasellar cisternal mass. Now we see in COVID times, the mucormycosis has really become very rampant, and an MRI along with MRA is the diagnosis modality of choice because it not only shows all the tissue changes, including involvement of extraocular muscles, but an MRA can also exactly say into which vessel has the mucor invaded. For example, this patient who presented with a CRO picture on MRA turned to have not only central retinal artery obstruction, but also an ophthalmic artery occlusion. MRI with DSA is the modality of choice for all arteriovenous malformation, which not only shows dilated superior ophthalmic vein, but the DSA also confirms this into exactly where the arteriovenous malformation is located. So when you ask for an MRI with a radiologist, you need not mention what sequences exactly you're looking for, because a radiologist can definitely provide you the sequences based on the study and how the lesion occurs. Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, so a communication with the radiologist is very important because you need to tell what you're expecting from the image so that it can be translated into the a report that can help you narrow the differential diagnosis, prognosticate before biopsy, and help in counseling the patient. Lastly, ultrasound of the orbit, although not very useful in diagnosing an orbital mass, but it is definitely valuable for intraocular pathology. For ultrasound, the main utility in orbital imaging is for probably cysticercosis for monitoring the treatment. Here, as you see, the ultrasound shows a scolex with a well-defined wall, and on treatment, the scolex has disappeared, and then sequentially the wall has collapsed, and finally the entire lesion has gone. So in summary, imaging how and what to request, it basically depends on the anatomy of interest, the orbital pathology that you're looking at and are expecting the lesion to be turn out to be. And finally, it also depends on how familiar you are with that particular diagnostic modality. In summary, you can say that for all orbital masses, a CT with or without contrast is adequate in most of the lesions. MRI is used as a problem-solving technique for lesion of uncertain tissue of origin and those which have an atypical appearance on CT scan. So that's all for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raksha ma'am. That was a really nice talk summarizing all the imaging modalities and their indication. Ma'am, I have one small question for you. In case of you have a suspected small AV malformations in the eyelid, what do you prefer as an imaging modality? Is it MRI, angio you go ahead with, or you suspect or you directly go ahead with the DSA or CT contrast? What is the modality that you prefer?
No. So for any arteriovenous malformation, like I already mentioned, an MRA is the most useful technique. And because some of these lesions are not just limited in the eyelid, but can they also extend into the orbit. And when you're treating an AV malformation, you must make sure that all the feeding arteries are closed. So if you just treat the eyelid lesion, that would not be sufficient. It would lead to recurrence of the lesion in case there is an orbital component. So definitely an MRA for such patients.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Any
you.
any questions from the panelists? Usha ma'am, can we move ahead?
Sorry.
Ma'am, can we go ahead with the second talk?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I think that was an excellent overview. So we can move on to the next talk. Yeah, please.
Next talk is by Dr. Ramesh Murthy sir on orbital infections. Sir, can you please share your screen? Raksha ma'am, you want to stop sharing. Technical team, can you help stop sharing the ongoing screen? Technical team? Ramesh Murthy sir, are you able to share the screen?
Yeah, now I'll be able to share the
Now
screen.
you-
Yes.
So Ramesh Murthy sir is a prolific oculoplasty and squint surgeon, and he goes all over from district to district, from Pune to Ahmednagar, covering more than half of the Maharashtra. He will be talking about orbital infections today. Sir, we are not able to see the screen yet. Yeah, now we can.
One moment. Thank you, Dr. Sumit, Dr. Honawar sir, and the entire organizing team of BOA for organizing such a wonderful conference and giving us the opportunity to talk. So I'll be talking about orbital infections, tips to diagnosis. So first of all, the pathogenesis. Am I audible and is the screen clear?
Very much so.
So first about talking about the pathogenesis. So this could happen by direct inoculation. So trauma, surgery, or orbital foreign bodies. Hematogenous spread because of sepsis or bacterial endocarditis. And again, through the facial venous system because it has many anastomosis and it is valveless. It could also be because of extension from adjacent structures like preceptal cellulitis, pharynx, middle ear, facial skin, nose, lacrimal gland, or the teeth. So here you can see in brief the various bones that make up the orbital walls and how it is very well connected to the region of the nose and behind through the inferior and the superior orbital fissures and the optic canal. So these are all potential sources of infection which can enter the orbit. So when a patient presents like this, we want to first classify the patient into a specific category so that we can do an effective treatment for the patient. So our classification is group 1 preseptal cellulitis, where the infection is very anterior. Group 2, where it involves the orbit, that is orbital cellulitis. And group 3 is subperiosteal abscess. Group 4 is an orbital abscess. And group 5 is the worst case scenario, that is a cavernous sinus thrombosis. So in preseptal cellulitis, there is definitely edema of the lids. There is inflammation. And sometimes preseptal cellulitis can become an orbital cellulitis. So when a child presents like this, we first want to look inside and make sure that there is no proptosis, the ocular movements are full, there is no pupillary involvement, the vision is maintained. So this is a classic case of preseptal cellulitis. Again, one more patient who presents with a more severe kind of presentation. But again, when you look inside, everything is good. He just has a preseptal cellulitis, which can be treated on an outpatient basis. But when a patient develops orbital cellulitis, he has other problems like visual loss, chemosis, limited ocular motility, and he is more systemically toxic. So this lady, you can see here, has chemosis, there is proptosis, there is ophthalmoplegia. You can see on the scan that there is inflammation behind the orbit. Again, one more patient who presents with severe orbital infection as well as a presence of corneal involvement infection inside the eye as well, so panophthalmitis. So how do we differentiate between preseptal versus orbital? Preseptal has got lid edema. There are no orbital signs. But in orbital cellulitis, we have got possible involvement of the various cranial nerves. There could be proptosis, visual impairment. Patient will have fever and other problems like leukocytosis. Sometimes you have this kind of presentation of a subperiosteal abscess where there is pus collection between the orbital bony wall and the periosteum. Here there is limitation of ocular motility and there is a directional proptosis. So in the picture, you can see the ethmoid sinus and a small subperiosteal collection which is extending into the orbit. This patient has got a superior subperiosteal abscess which can be very clearly seen on the MRI scan. So we go ahead and just make an incision and you can see the pus coming out and he recovers beautifully with oral antibiotics. So orbital abscess has a more severe presentation as compared to a subperiosteal abscess. There is ptosis, proptosis, visual loss, internal and external ophthalmoplegia and forehead anesthesia. So this gentleman had an abscess on the temporal side of the orbit. And you can see it on the CT scan very clearly, and there's limitation of abduction in the left eye. And then we drain this abscess and he recovers beautifully with the oral antibiotics. So we need to differentiate between a subperiosteal versus an orbital abscess. A subperiosteal abscess is much more slower in progression. There is a limitation of ocular motility, usually directional proptosis, may or may not have chemosis, not much visual impairment. But the orbital abscess got severe proptosis, systemic toxicity. There could be ophthalmoplegia, and the patient may have an orbital apex syndrome where there is not only involvement of the cranial nerves, but also the vision can get affected. The most important thing that we need to recognize is the cavernous sinus thrombosis, which affects about 1% of cases of orbital cellulitis, which has a high mortality. The reason you can see here that the cavernous sinus is just right behind the orbit, and all the major veins are communicating with the cavernous sinus. So when a patient has cavernous sinus thrombosis, he presents with headache, high fever, he is toxic. There is periorbital edema, proptosis, chemosis, paralysis of eye movements, and it could be bilateral. The pathognomonic feature is the presence of cranial nerve 4 or 6th involvement. So the sequence is usually orbital cellulitis, which goes on to develop into cavernous sinus thrombosis. And these are the patients who actually need a lot of anticoagulation therapy. So here you can see this patient who has severe sinusitis, infection in the sinuses, and he has developed a cavernous sinus thrombosis with a severely toxic state who needs a hospital admission. So these kind of infections of the orbit are more common in males and more common in adults. So when we are confronted with such a case, our approach should be to find what is the source of infection, try to find out the risk factors, and try to find out where exactly is the infection. If there is loss of eyesight, we think of the orbit, the cavernous sinus, or the cranial central nervous system. If this forehead paresthesia, we think of the cavernous sinus or the posterior orbit. If it's bilateral, we think of the cavernous sinus or a more posterior involvement like the brain is involved. And vision loss could be because of various causes like corneal damage, raised intraocular pressure, thrombophlebitis, CRAO, or optic neuritis. Risk factors include, if there's slow onset, it could be a fungal kind of infection, syphilis or tuberculosis. In HIV patients, cryptococcosis and toxoplasmosis are more common. The diabetes mellitus patients generally end up with having a more severe kind of disease like a mucormycosis. Travel could also be a reason, which could give rise to different kinds of parasitic infections. And patients who have leukemia, lymphoma, renal transplant, or who are on deferoxamine therapy can develop conditions like mucormycosis or aspergillosis. So we need to identify what is the source of infection, the sinuses, the teeth, or it is a dacryocystitis, or it is surgeries, foreign body, animal bites. So once we know what is the source of infection, we want to know whether it is preseptal, it is orbital, or it is retroorbital. We want to look at the nasal and the oral mucosa. We look at the vital signs of the patient, also do a cardiac examination to rule out endocarditis. So there are various causes like Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus, MRSA, or Haemophilus influenzae, which can give rise to infection. The systemic investigations would include a complete blood count with differential and blood cultures if needed. CT is useful because we can look at the bone, but more useful is an MRI scan, which is better soft tissue visualization. A contrast enhanced MRI is always better. We can look at the cavernous sinus, look for cavernous sinus thrombosis. We can also do a diffusion weighted imaging to differentiate from tumors, hematoma, ischemia, and infarction. A nasopharyngeal endoscopy is especially useful if you are looking for mucormycosis, and CSF analysis for looking for various kinds of infections of the brain. The management differs between preseptal and orbital infections. Preseptal we can manage with oral antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, steroids to prevent an inflammation. And usually we manage it with a combination of amoxicillin 500 milligrams with clavulanic acid 125 milligrams. Orbital cellulitis needs IV antibiotics, and with newer antibiotics like linezolid, it responds better. Children also need to be treated in consult with a pediatrician. So we give IV medication till there is good improvement or the eye appears normal, and then we switch over to oral medication for a longer period. We give nasal decongestants if necessary, and if you feel that there is an abscess, then surgical drainage is the treatment of choice. For cavernous sinus thrombosis, apart from the antibiotics, we also need to give anticoagulants and possibly steroids. So prognosis is quite bad when there is severe orbital cellulitis or cavernous sinus thrombosis, because that carries nearly 50% mortality. Vision loss could be because of neurotrophic keratitis, glaucoma, optic neuritis, or central retinal artery occlusion. Mucormycosis will be covered by one of our speakers. So 2 words about parasitic infections. Cysticercosis luckily has become very less frequent now. So in this, it is a Tinea solium larval form, which actually affects the various parts of the eye. Usually it affects the conjunctiva, the eyelids, the muscles, and we want to look for the larval form of the scolex on the ultrasound or on the CT scan. It can affect the extraocular muscles to a great extent, and it responds beautifully to oral medication. Here you can see the ultrasound B scan, which shows the scolex of the cyst inside the behind the eye. So treatment is albendazole, and if along with oral steroids, and if there is neurocystic sarcosis, possibly praziquantel, and if it's lying in the vitreous, then a vitrectomy. Echinococcus or hydatid disease, again in humans, are the intermediate host. Here also patient could present with proptosis, exposure keratitis, optic atrophy or blindness. And it could be monocystic or it could be multicystic. Again, diagnosis based on ultrasound, CT and MRI. And therapy is surgical removal and giving the patient albendazole or mebendazole.
Dr. Murthy, will you please
Rhinospiritis
sum
again,
up?
yes, I'm just last slide. Rhinospiritis again is a rare condition, and it's a mucocutaneous disease. Sometimes we do encounter this in the orbit as polypoidal growths. So in summary, in any case of orbital infection, it is very important to differentiate between the milder preseptal variety and the more severe orbital variety. We need to find out what is the cause of infection or what is the source of infection or where it has actually spread from. And you have to give the appropriate management for these cases to get a good outcome. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, ma'am, would you like to have any remarks?
Yeah, I think this was an excellent overview and summarizing all the important and relevant points and the tips to manage. But one thing I'd like to emphasize is there are a lot of times that people pump in antibiotics in cases of abscess, which is something very wrong for the patient. It forms an antibioma, becomes very difficult to manage later. That is one aspect that we need to definitely emphasize. When you do an imaging and you see an abscess, it has to be drained and not treated just with antibiotics. The other thing is the role of steroids. Steroids is very important in cellulitis, and it is important that we start simultaneously or a day after the antibiotics is started in order to minimize the the sequelae of the fibrosis and other aspects. So it's very, very important that we do that. And again, the parasitic infestations, it is based on the geographic area. We still have a lot of cysticercosis to deal with, and rhinosporidiosis, especially in Kerala belt, there is a lot of rhinosporidiosis. Again, it's geographic. So I think it's a great presentation sharing all the aspects, and I think we learn from a lot from this. Thanks, Dr. Ramesh.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Dr. Sunil Morekar, who will be giving his experience of mucormycosis, which has created havoc nowadays post-COVID. So over to Dr. Sunil Morekar. Sunil Morekar, sir, are you there?
Yeah. Just start my presentation. Is it showing?
Yes, yes, it is.
Thank the organizers, especially Dr. Lahani, Sumit, and Ragini madam, for giving me this opportunity to share my experience across 8 hospitals in 2 cities. I have been working as the Diabetic Eye Care Committee member for quite some time, and we've been talking about issues with diabetic eye beyond retinopathy, and mucormycosis is definitely something that we've been talking about. As a fallout of COVID, yes, a lot of people have been talking about this. There have been a lot of news reports, and people have been talking about it as if there is a next pandemic coming in. I'd be more worried about Candida auris as the next pandemic rather than mucormycosis. The preparedness in many aspects of COVID, there are roughly around 1,000 ACCME accredited CME credit hours, which I have accrued around in the last 1.5 years. There's one international COVID conference. There's another Stanford COVID conference, which is coming in case anybody is interested. Because when you treat something like mucormycosis, you want to know all aspects of the COVID in terms of what all it can affect in the body and how it helps mucormycosis and how mucormycosis is synergistic with it. I would stand right next to Dr. V.K. Paul. I have met him and we've discussed a couple of things. As he says, there's no big outbreak. I would agree to it. The mucormycosis incidence has definitely increased, but it's marginal compared to the number of cases of COVID which we are seeing. There's no big outbreak, but statistically it is more than what it was last year, but not very high. So I'm showing my experience across 8 hospitals across Mumbai and Navi Mumbai. What we've been keeping in mind is that most of the times what you really want to see is that you want to follow evidence-based medicine and not go into eminence-based, vehemence-based or eloquence-based or diffidence or confidence or nervousness or defensive medicine and trying to deal with the patient. It is evidence, and what you apply that evidence in the real world. So the real world data is what is important. So here's my real world data. So what are the lessons learned? I have selected 15 points. There are a lot of cases which have had over 13 months, 8 corporate hospitals. Almost all the patients were male, 2 females. The mean age is 61. The mean sugar as expected. All patients had ketoacidosis. One had a CRAO bilaterally, one Garson syndrome. Retrovalvular amphotericin was used by us. Ampho plus posaconazole, and in select cases, avasaconazole was used. 2 exentrations so far. So this is something that is important. All except three patients who died are presently, all of them are alive except those 3. But 2 are still more critical. So you might have a death rate of 5 out of 31, which is pretty high. One is lost to follow-up after 1 month, but what I gather is he's doing well at another place. What we need to keep in mind is the concept of microbiome. So we talk about microbiome, but we now probably need to look at microbiomes and viromes in our body. So they would probably be there with us all the time. And the minute our immunity goes down, the viromes would have an upper hand, or the microbiomes would have an upper hand. So as Nicholas Money stated, the spores are everywhere. And by the time I finish the statement, maybe you inhaled a lot of them. So what are the lessons that we have learned? The lessons we have learned is that the grading and scoring is important before we rush into exentation, because I get a lot of calls saying that mucormycosis, please come and exentate. So that's not the be all and the end all of it. There are multiple things involved. You have to grade the mucormycosis and score it. And this is a scoring system we use, which has been developed by Dr. Renuka Brado from Sion Hospital. So you have vision, pupil, ocular motility, proptosis, and intracranial spread, and you grade that from 0, 2, and 3. And based on whether it is normal or there's decreased vision or blindness, RAPD or fixed pupils, extraocular muscles or completely fixed eyeball. And then you look at fundus changes and you look at imaging changes. And you give a score to each one of this. And based on the scoring system, patients who cross a score of 23 are definitely eligible for orbital exentation. But the ENT and the ophthalmologist, at least 2 ophthalmologists, have to agree to it. Lesson number 2 we learned was that it's not necessary that if you have mucormycosis, you won't have anything else. We have had a patient who has mucor plus aspergillus in the same patient in the sinus. Sometimes you might have mucormycosis in the eye, and you might have Candida auris in the urinary tract. You might have aspergillosis in the lungs. So you've got to be careful about what you do. So you have to look at multiple modalities which you will look at. One of the things that helps you is galactomannan and BD-glucan. So galactomannan is a polysaccharide component of aspergillosis which is released into the body, and serum galactomannan assay has been used for supervising early detection and timely diagnosis in patients who are neutropenic. So this is something that you look at. You also look at beta-D-glucan, and when this is high, it's usually aspergillosis and not mucor. But definitely when this is high, and then people come and tell me, Sunil, this is aspergillosis, this is not mucor. And I said that not necessarily. It's just that the cell wall of aspergillus is there. You may have a coexisting infection at all. So a positive does not rule out mucormycosis, but a positive definitely tells you that there is aspergillosis there in that case. Lesson number 3, early endoscopy and biopsy is a must. Because there are cases in which we missed it on a swab, and then when we look at the biopsy and the biopsy sent to the histopathologist shows you the mucor, and the swab and the culture has not showed it. So you might catch it much earlier if you've taken a small biopsy and picked up and seen. Also, what you will see at that point, that when you take the biopsy and it does not bleed, that tells you at that point of time that this is probably mucormycosis. The endoscopy is extremely important. This is something that we have done the endoscopically exentration, and we looked at the surface. So ENT and ophthalm together makes a lot of sense. We have to keep our egos aside and work together. We don't have to keep our specialties demarcated. We have all got to get together, get the neurologist involved, get the neurosurgeon involved, get the microbiologist, the pathologist, the radiologist, everybody involved, and then you work together with the critical care person, trying to figure out whether you can up the antifungal and prevent an exenteration, or down the antifungal, go ahead and straight do a exenteration. The lesson number 4 that we learned was amphotericin B retroorbital is something that works. In this case here, you would see that there is a cannula which has been put into the nose, into the orbital cavity. So from this is Dr. Milind Navlakhe who's done this. That's an excellent idea he's done, that you put in a cannula there. So instead of giving a BD injection of retroorbital amphotericin B, you just flush it with amphotericin B twice a day for 5 days, and then you realize that you don't even need to do exenteration. So in a lot of cases that he has treated, he has ended up doing only one exenteration. So most of the patients he's been able to save without any exenteration. Lesson number 4 is that when you see something like this, a fixed dilated pupil and a proptosis, you have to understand that the prognostication is bad. There are some cases in which the prognosis is so bad that you know that even after you do an exenteration, the patient is not going to be alive. So you need to tell this to the patient's relative, because they think that you did an eyeball. They are told that you remove the eyeball and the patient will be saved. You tell them the eyeball we are trying to take out, and this patient is not going to live anyways, because the prognostication says that even the exenteration will not work. Patient may decide not to do an exenteration. The other co-infections that we have seen in this pandemic era is that there is mucor and tuberculosis co-infection. So we've seen a patient with something like this, and this is a patient without an exenteration has got better with tuberculosis as well as mucor infection, and this is done with rigorous debridement and a lot of retroorbital amphotericin B. So retroorbital amphotericin B does not give you the problems which you have with corona. Gives you an AKI, or an acute kidney injury, and there you are stuck with not giving systemic medications because you don't want to spoil the kidney. Here you would see that you see all scans, you see that there is a little cranial lesion there, and when you look at it, the cranial lesion is huge, and that is a tuberculoma and not a mucormycosis. And you need to get all the sections. You need sagittal, coronal, and the same. Look at it from a 3D view, even for the imaging. The prognosis is good even if the mucormycosis is combined with tuberculosis. This is something that we know, but we need not quote this to the patient, because with COVID, with tuberculosis, with mucormycosis, we know that the results may be bad, though one patient of ours has survived and done very well. What we also want to see is, most of the time people send me a picture like this, and from the COVID ward, and say, okay, sir, this is it, and opine. I would like to open the eye. I would have to look at the fundus, and you can't tell me to opine on a particular case without opening up the eye. So there are times when they open up the eye. Here you see that the patient himself is opening up the eye, and you will see that there is paronychia and there is fungal infection even in his nails. So the lesson number 6 that we learned was neurotrophic ulcer occurs if there is trigeminal involvement or ciliary ganglion involvement with the fungus itself and a frozen robe, or while you are trying to do a endoscopic clearance, you might end up injuring the ganglion and you might get a neurotrophic ulcer. Lesson number 7, retrobulbar works. Retrobulbar works extremely well. You see the patient has got a lot of proptosis, and post retrobulbar vision saved, and the patient has gone home. Retrobulbar endoscopically works still better. So that is a dose, 1 ml of 3.5 milligrams per ml after retrobulbar injection of anesthetic. You expect a lot of inflammation after this and a yellow chemosis for 1 week, but you will see the patient's GC improving and the patient getting much better. There are multiple case reports and series there. Ours is a case series of roughly around 10 patients who have done very well with retrobulbar injection. This is something that we have presented before this thing at ESOPus, where we're talking about orbital mucormycosis without exenteration. Endoscopic retrobulbar is this is the way you give it. You open up the ethmoid, or you open up the area where you had the mucormycosis. You take a bend needle and you inject it with there, or you do the way Dr. Milind Navlakhe does, is he puts in a cannula. You have to be careful. You have to be extremely well covered if you're going to do this, because you are trying to create a situation where there will be aerosols. Sometimes you might have bilateral involvement, and those are the cases who are going to do extremely bad even after you do anything for this patient. So you have to keep the relatives informed and tell them that this is something which is not amenable to treatment. This is a patient from Kohinoor Hospital who's done extremely well with retrobulbar injections. There are other therapies available. There is cytokine therapy, but here you already have a cytokine storm, so you can't give that. There are granulocyte transfusions.
Will you please sum up, sir?
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt.
So lesson number 9 is isavuconazole. The vital study has shown that it works. In our cases also it has worked. The role of iron, you know that serum, so we noted the serum ferritin when it precipitously falls, that is when on the 15th or the 20th day the patient gets mucormycosis. Lesson number 11 is role of statins. You give the patient statins. These are the persons, the statin somehow also ends up being mucor destroying. And there are lots of evidences, and we have also found it. You know there are polymicrobial infections possible. One of our cases are hyperviscomucous Klebsiella pneumonia, which is multi-drug resistant. You always see the palate, and you might see viral infections also. The spread may be hematogenous and not contiguous. So doing an exentation, take it out, and the patient is saying, no, there might be spread even with the hematogenous. And there's Garson syndrome, which we have seen, where the mycelium grows along the cranial nerves or invasion of the leptomeninges. This is our case of Garson syndrome. It is spreading along the leptomeninges. So what we've seen correlates with published literature, especially Sumit's paper and also Dr. Gokhale's son. And the limitation we have is there is missing data because patients are referred to us from rural data. So eventually, finally, what you know that the modern medical team has got a lot of things. There are a lot of limitations. They manage much more better. I tell them if they go to JJ or to a municipal hospital, because in private the number of things involved are huge. So that's about what my experience is. Thank you. And that's my email address and phone number in case anybody wants to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for enlightening us on this burning topic for this post-COVID. Any comments from the panelists? Dr. Sauri, would you like to add something? Madam?
Yeah. Sunil, that was excellently covered. So I think we've all been seeing this, and being in a multi-speciality hospital, the first and the foremost thing I would say is your last line holds the most importance. It is a team effort to have a win-win situation. Otherwise, it really does not work. Having said that, I would probably concur with most of the lines of management you have spoken, that yes, you need to do concurrent treatment. FES is the first way of debriding it. If you catch it early and you do FES, then I think it saves a lot of problems. If there's early orbital involvement, and that's the message to mid-orbit, you do not need to exenterate. Sometimes only systemic antifungals work. Even a TRAMB is not required. But yes, in cases where we found where it's mid-orbit to approaching orbital apex, where systemic and ampholamb is not working, especially liposomal, or with combination of posaconazole, then in those cases you could and should definitely, and we have also started giving, but we do choose our cases with caution for the retroamphotericin B, because like you rightly said, we have to protect ourselves, and it's not always a win-win situation to explain to the patients, but we are also tending to do less exenterations. We are not keen on jumping into it, but that's not the situation outside. And I think what Sunil said, awareness is probably the way to go, but in a team way. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next speaker is Dr. Mangesh, who will be talking on bite-eyed orbital blowout fractures. Dr. Mangesh?
Yeah. My screen is visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
So at the outside, I would like to thank organizers, Dr. Lahane sir and the team for this wonderful session. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this amazing meeting. So I'd like to speak on the white-eyed blowout fracture. This is an easily overlooked entity. So we'll be discussing this topic on this heading. What is this specifically? How is it different from the other orbital fracture? How does it get overlooked easily? What happens if it gets overlooked? When to operate? What is the surgical technique? Which implant to be used? What are the common complications? And what's the conclusion at the end? So what is this? So if you look at the orbital fractures as a whole, you can divide it into pure orbital fractures and the impure ones. Pure means it is the internal fractures not involving the rim and other associated fractures, but the impure involves all. So if you go even for the pure orbital fractures, then you will have open trapdoor fractures and the closed trapdoor fractures. So open trapdoor fractures are specifically, these are the large floor fractures commonly found in adults, and the closed trapdoor fractures, these are basically the white-eyed blood fractures. These are the linear or the minimally displaced fractures. So we have to closed trapdoor fractures. So what happens in these closed trapdoor fractures? These are commonly found in the pediatric group. There is no, actually, even in spite of the history of the significant trauma, there will be no or minimal periorbital edema, subconjunctival hemorrhoid. So essentially, there will be no signs of the orbital inflammation or no ocular signs at all. How is it different from the other orbital fractures? Other fractures that commonly happen in the adults, that is the open trapdoor fractures. Here the bones are actually mature, brittle, and less flexible. So it leads to the large floor fractures with a more herniation of the soft tissue than the entrapment. And there is a no muscle compartment syndrome, no associated edema, and there is associated edema and the hemorrhage. But what happens in the WEBOB, that is a white-eyed blood fracture? It is commonly found in the pediatric population. Bones are relatively softer, more flexible, and these tibial fractures, they are the minimally displaced fractures with the flexible bones. They spring back into position, entrapping soft tissue and so it causes muscle entrapment syndrome, and these are not associated with the edema, hemorrhage, subconjunctival hemorrhage, periorbital edema. So what are the clinical features? There is a significant motility restriction due to the muscle entrapment associated with the diplopia, can have oculocardiac reflex, causing a bradycardia and arrhythmia, nausea, vomiting, syncopal attacks, and even a lethal result leading to death in some of the cases. Why actually does it get easily overlooked initially? Because of the white eyes, no ocular signs, nausea, vomiting, diplopia, and all these signs are most of the times they are ascribed to the head injury. How not to miss it? Simply by the full ophthalmic examination in all cases of the maxillofacial trauma, especially extraocular movements. These are often overlooked. If you take a look at this 23 years clerk, she had sustained injury at the age of 6 years. She was diagnosed to have a head injury, and the primary imaging, that is the CT brain, was normal and no evidence of the fracture. Similarly, this is a bus conductor at the age of 33 years, injury at the age of 8 years. He has diplopia, work difficulty, and the same scenario. Even if you look at the clinical feature, this is a boy who has sustained blunt trauma 5 days back. There is a primary case, no problem, but there is a restriction of the elevation on the left side. Axial cuts, no orbital fractures, but the coronal cut shows a very minimal fracture in the floor causing inferior entrapment. It can have to the medial orbital wall also, this patient with the right face turn, and you can see there is no ptosis, no down and out. Actually, patient has left exotropia and limitation in adduction only. Abduction is normal. So this patient was diagnosed with a partial third nerve palsy, and on the axial closure cuts, you can see that there is entrapment of the medial rectus muscle. So these fractures can occur in the medial wall as well as the floor fracture. What it gets overlooked? It can lead to the muscle compartment syndrome, leading to the ischemic injury and the muscle fibrosis, which can lead to the permanent dysfunction and diplopia even after the best possible intervention. So this has to be operated as early as possible, preferably within 8 hours, because the late presentation can have a suboptimal outcome even of the best efforts. For the floor fractures, transconjunctival fornix incision with lateral canthotomy. For the medial ones, incisions are the direct, easy, hidden, and the cosmetically good one. So these are the transconjunctival incisions. So you will open up into the and go and dissect into the retro suborbicularis area and the preseptal plane. And in some of the cases, you will have to enlarge the fracture also to release the entrapped tissue. Use the silicone, here the old photos. So I will also share the newer methods of contoured silicone sheet. So FDT is done, and at the end you will see there is only one suture at the lateral canthus, and patients can have a gratifying results if done timely. So this is the post transconjunctival orbital floor fractures. There is a good restoration of the extraocular movements. Even in the medial wall, this patient was access to the transcalencular approach, and the patient's squint also improved very well. And not only squint and adduction or extraocular movements, but the patient had got his face turn also improved. So which implant basically used? No implant, actually, where entire tissue gets released by just bending the flexible bones. It's in the early cases. That is, by opening the trap door, you can release the all entire tissue. So no implant is required in those specific cases. But implant is required where fracture set had to be enlarged to release the entire tissue, and the chances of re-entrapment and the herniation are there. Variety of implant material is available, like porous polyethylene, titanium, Medcore plus titanium, nylon foils, and the novel bioresourceable polycaprolactone, that is osteomate. But my preferred choice is 1 mm silicone sheets because of its simplicity, fixity, low cost, and the minimal implant issues. Now this is the contouring, or you can say how to make a template. This is a 1 mm silicone sheet. You have to make a tongue out of this, and if you consider that this is the floor fracture, then you have to intervene, and this tongue has to oppose to the orbital rim so that it does not move and it gets fixed well to the orbital floor. So I have got practically no implant issues with this particular type of the silicone sheets. So what are the complications? All other complications like for orbital floor fracture repair are there, but just to find out, this is not a complication basically, but the post of early hypertrophy will always be there along with the periorbital edema, which will get resolved over a week or so. The important complication you can see is the suboptimal outcome, which is actually, and most of the times, is because of the leg presentation and the local ischemic injury to the muscle. Now you can see in this case on the right side, there is no evidence of the inferior rectus. Inferior rectus is not seen, it is there in the trapdoor, and it's totally entrapped over there. This is a missing muscle syndrome. So this patient, if you see there is a missing muscle, then there is a guarded prognosis for the restoration of the extraocular muscle. So we restored this sheet, and even after restoration, patient had some limitation of the upgaze, and the muscle shows the muscle edema, and the lateral rectus muscle also shows some edema. So in conclusion, this is an important entity not to be missed at all. You need to have a simple thorough history at the clinical examination, including extraocular movements. You should keep very low threshold for the imaging, even if there is no ocular sign, if the patient is presented with a nausea, vomiting, and the diplopia, especially CT orbits, coronal cuts. Proper preoperative counseling is must for the early surgery, especially because the parents, they are not really willing for the early surgery. And at the same time, they have to explain the consequences of the late surgery, no surgery, and the suboptimal outcomes if you do the delayed surgery. So timely surgery will have a gratifying outcome in most of the cases. Thank you very much for kind listening.
Thank you, Dr. Mangesh. It's a very precise and wonderful presentation. Now I would like to call upon Dr. Dave for the next presentation. Dr. Dave?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah.
Sumit, Dr. Lahane sir, Dr. Ragini ma'am, and Dr. Honavar, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of BOA. I'm going to talk to you about secondary volume augmentation in anophthalmic sockets. Is my screen visible? Am I audible?
It is there. No problem.
So I have no financial disclosures to make, and you will see full face photographs of some of my patients for which we have the consent obtained. Now, when we talk of socket surgery, there are two prerequisites. One is an ideal volume replacement, and second is a customized ocular prosthesis. And when both of these have been done right, you can have an excellent outcome of socket surgery, as you see in this gentleman who has a right prosthetic eye. When we're talking about volumetrics, it's always good to get the volume right in the primary sitting itself, where actually when you're performing either your evisceration or enucleation, you sought for surgical strategies that allow you to place a relatively larger implant so that you do not end up with a sulcus deformity post-operatively. So if you look at these two patients, then I'm sorry about that. Okay, so if you look at these two patients, this is a lady who has an excellent volume replacement with a sulcus, which is nice, full, symmetric to the other side, no eyelid issues, no lid retraction, and nothing at all that would suggest, that the left side is prosthetic, versus a gentleman who's had a surgery done with a smaller implant and has a superior sulcus deformity, as you see over here, with a little bit of retraction of the lower eyelid. So this is when you have performed surgery in the primary sitting. Now, what can you do when you already are in a situation where you have some amount of volume deficit? This is a scenario where you can resort to one of the several surgical options as shown here pictorially. And I'll take you through these one by one. This is a sort of a surgical talk. So if you can't see the videos, please let me know. Now, the first surgery here is a secondary implant, and this is preferred when you do not have any implant in the anophthalmic socket. So you'd want to put a ball implant in that situation. And what is being done over here is meticulous dissection to raise three flaps, the conjunctiva, the anterior tenons, and finally the posterior tenons. And doing this sort of opening up of the socket is extremely important. You see the shiny, glistening posterior tenons holding the intraconal fat over there. Once you've identified that cavity, you put in your implant, and you again repeat your closure in the same three layers, which is your posterior tenons, then the anterior tenons. Once you've closed the anterior tenons, assess the conjunctiva. If there is a surface loss, you have the opportunity of augmenting the surface in the same sitting by performing Fornix formation sutures and harvesting a mucous membrane graft to give back the surface area that is lost. So here you are seeing the measurement being performed on the bed of the socket to raise a mucous membrane graft from the lip area. This is a relatively older video, and now I've moved on to dissecting without the use of a radiofrequency cautery for socket surgeries, and I'm definitely seeing better outcomes post-operatively. So once you have your mucous membrane graft harvested, you can close the lip with an amniotic membrane graft and place in that graft in the bed of the socket to give you back the surface area that is desirous. And after this, you do a standard closure, tying up all your sutures and placing a conformer. And this gives you an excellent outcome post-operatively, as you see over here, a patient sans implant and post-implant placed in a secondary manner. The MMGs, this image is just to show you that they seamlessly take up with the residual conjunctiva, and in a socket which has not been operated several times, you get an excellent outcome with mucous membrane used as a substrate for surface area. Now, a second surgery that can be done in this situation where you do not have an implant is a dermis fat graft. And here again, the initial steps are very similar. Video will just show you the harvesting of the dermis fat graft, which can either be done from the buttock or the abdominal areas. You make your markings based on the defect size that you get. You generally tend to oversize by about 20 to 30%. You remove the epidermis. You can shave it off with a blade, as you saw over here, or use one of the fancy burrs to remove the skin, and then harvest your graft, which has the dermis as well as the fat component, and close the wound. While this does leave the patient with donor site morbidity in terms of a scar, but it's very rewarding to operate dermis fat grafts since they tend to take up very nicely in the socket, especially sockets that have not been operated several times. Once you've harvested the graft, you anchor it to the surrounding conjunctiva and tenons. If you are in a position where you can get the extraocular muscles and suture it to the edges of the dermis fat graft, nothing like it. Those muscles provide the additional much required vascularity for the graft to take up. So these are the two surgeries that you would use in situations where you have absolutely no implant within the socket, and you tend to get very good postoperative outcomes. Now, what about situations where you do have an implant, but they are slightly smaller? In such situations, one another option is to put a second implant along the floor of the orbit. And I tend to reserve this technique for those patients who have a smaller implant, which is also slightly migrated inferiorly and is giving you a hypoglobic appearance of the prosthesis. So the surgery is fairly simple. Since the patient is anophthalmic, there is no globe to worry about. You expose your inferior orbital rim and the floor in a standard fashion, like how you do for a fracture surgery. And once you've done that, you can place in any sort of implant that you fancy. What I'm using here is a Porex wedge. The wedge sort of tends to give you the additional volume that you want to build up. And if you tend to use barrier sheets here, they sort of give you a little bit of suboptimal outcome. The Porex wedge can be secured with cyanoacrylate glue or can be just left in position once you have it just behind the inferior orbital rim. You're seeing glue being used here to secure the wedge. I'm a little old fashioned and I like to keep the Porex wedge hugging the orbital floor with the help of glue, and it gives you an excellent outcome. So this is a patient who's had absolutely no eyelid surgery, but just the placement of a Porex wedge inferiorly, and you can see how beautifully the hypoglobic appearance of the anophthalmic socket has got corrected, along with a buildup in the superior sulcus. Another option for patients who have a small implant is to do an autologous fat transfer. Now, again, fat can be harvested from any areas of excess. You could harvest it from the chin and place it in the orbit, or from the abdomen, or from the buttock or thigh area, based on your discussion with the patient. These incisions are very small and are practically insignificant. The technique has a little bit of learning curve, and there is some amount of resorption rate of the fat. However, it's very gratifying in patients who need minimal improvement in the enophthalmos. So here the fat is being made to separate from the serum component and is finally injected behind the implant using specialized cannula to induce proptosis on table and get an overcorrection of about 30 to 40%, which eventually with time settles down to give you a very good correction. So minimal amount of enophthalmos, fat transfer is the procedure of choice. Now, for patients who do not want any surgical intervention, one quick procedure is just to do a filler injection. This is a child where we are performing a filler injection. This child has congenital clinical anophthalmia, and we are doing this instead of doing regular implant exchanges to build up the orbital volume. But this could be done even for any adult patient, where the technique of injection is very simple. You could either go transconjunctival, or you could even go like your standard retrobulbar block fashion to inject your filler behind the orbital implant. This is one gentleman who's had...
Sorry to interrupt, you have to wrap up, please.
Yes, wrapping up, just the last slide.
Yeah.
So here you see a superior sulcus deformity, which has been corrected just by the injection of filler. So in essence, I've spoken to you about the several options available for secondary volume augmentation. I'm going to skip this part in the interest of time. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, I think we will take the questions at the end of the session because we are running short of time.
Done.
Yeah, thanks for the excellent videos, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Sauri. Dr. Sauri Desai.
Yes.
Yeah, please start.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the entire BOA and MOS team. It's been a fantastic program and got every, all the faculties from everywhere, which is a real bonanza. Sumit, on a personal note, it's been a really good program, and I know all the efforts that have gone along with Dr. SH, but still you've done a great job. So I'll be speaking on orbital lymphangioma, the spectrum. Okay, so we know that it's a congenital anomaly. Initially, they were known as hamartomas, but recently, according to the International Society of Vascular Anomalies, they've been classified as vascular malformations, and the Orbital Society also has classified them as vascular malformations of the low-grade type. 75% are seen in the head and neck region, and they usually may not be noticeable on birth, maybe very subtly, which is not picked up by the parents, but is picked up more in the first decade or the first 2 years of life. Commonly, this is seen when the child becomes more active, and because of that can present either as a bleed or due to upper respiratory tract infections. So they're classified actually based on radiological parameters. So radiologically, they're classified according to, one is on the sonography and one is on the CT-MRI. So they're classified as superficial lesions, which are commonly seen as multiple cystic spaces filled with, which looks like, so this girl has bled also a little bit recently, but light pinkish to dark pinkish lesions, commonly seen in the conjunctival area. You have, and also maybe involving the lid and the adnexa, but primarily the conjunctiva. Then you have deeper lesions involving the orbit. Combined is obviously a mix of both, and complexes involving anywhere outside of the orbit in the head and neck region. And some classifications say that they also involve other parts of the body. Ultrasonographically, which actually is really a simple tool but works really well, is to know whether they're macrocystic, microcystic, or mixed. Now, here is an example taken from a sonography done by Dr. Deepak Bhatt, which shows macrocystic lesions. And this really is helpful because it helps us plan our diagnosis. Microcystic, you'll see multiple well-defined lesions such as this, which, and as we know, they're all very well interconnected. So what is the goals of management? It's preservation of vision, because in cases where there are orbital lesions, you don't want any compression of the nerve. So the primary thing is preservation of vision. It could either be due to compression or causing excessive proptosis, prevention of any amblyopia, and of course, even cosmetic disfigurement, because it can affect the child's mental status. Management is, before we go on, they often present in the young, when they start becoming very active, they present with sudden onset proptosis, such as this, and they appear even worse than this, predominantly with extraocular movement restriction, sometimes a vision drop, pupillary involvement. And in this child, he had had a bleed. He had been coming to me since he was 7, he's 9 here. And he also developed something new, which was having palatal lesions, which can occur if they are involving the face. And he did have maxillary lesions, but he had a sudden outburst of these, and you have to manage it. So this is not this child's MRI, but in some patients, you'll often see even fluid levels, which is characteristic. One thing you must note is that if you see a feeder vessel, then you have to rethink your diagnosis, because you don't commonly see feeder vessels in lymphangiomas. They are associated with high flow lesions such as hemangiomas. So when there's an acute hemorrhage, you want to treat it, preserve vision. So you need to go in and aspirate it, keep a pressure. And the role of steroids is variable, but I do prefer giving a low dose steroids of 0.5 milligram per kilogram as is based for the child's age for a period of 2 to 4 weeks, just to decrease the inflammation and keep the eye quiet. Coming to surgical management, often much before sclerosing therapy was really in vogue, we used to do debulking surgeries. I mean, in my fellowship, that's what I really learned. And as you can see, this girl has a left eye lymphangioma diffuse involving the entire orbit. And you can see there's a light mild.
Many constitutional provisions. So when the LOC was supposedly to hold it once.
I'll just continue. So in the globe, you can see that she started getting a vision drop, and her vision had dropped around 612, 624.
Hello.
Technical team, can you please mute everyone?
Yeah.
So in this case, she's about 9 years old, and she came with a slight drop in the vision. So even though that they were not classically macrocystic, they were microcystic, engulfing the entire orbit, I decided to do a debulking surgery because of involvement of the vision. And I was very happy with my results, but as you know, you cannot completely excise it. Otherwise, you can damage other tissues. You can only remove what is possible and counsel him that there is a possibility that they will recur, as did after this is at 12 and a half years when she came again with a proptosis and a little bit of a conjunctival hemorrhage. And here she's being prepared for a sclerosing therapy. So non-surgical management is intralesional sclerosing agents. So what are these and how do they work? They cause irritation of the endothelial lining with inflammation and fibrosis. The first one to be tried many years ago in the 1970s was sodium moreuate. And then there was sodium tetradecyl sulfate. But the current, agents which are being used a lot is pisibinil, which I personally don't use. However, it's known to have good results with lesser inflammation. But I use bleomycin, which I'll be coming to. So bleomycin is an anti-neoplastic antibiotic which is fermented from Streptomyces verticillus, which is a type of fungus. However, the main thing is that it was found when it was being used for pleural effusion that it had this sclerosing property, because of which it got its involution, and that's how it started being used by head and neck surgeons for lymphangiomas, and they saw that they had excellent results. So it's available as a freeze-dried powder. It's 15 international units. Everyone has to have a full workup. You check their vision, you check, document extraocular movements. You please see that they don't have any allergies or hypersensitivity to other drugs. And basically everyone undergoes a complete ophthalmic and dilated fundus examination. So the recommended dose is, there are enough literature, but there is to provide in the head and neck, but also a lot of good ophthalmic literature, which is now published, especially with Mukherjee et al. Dr. Bipasha has done, Dr. Nirav and Bipasha have done, then Dr. Honavar has done. They've all done a very good job of, publishing this data. So it's available there. So 0.25 to 0.5 international units kilogram body weight. But since it's freeze-dried, you have to reconstitute it with sterile water in equal volumes with lignocaine. We use laryngeal mask anesthesia because it does not take very long, not more than 15 to 20 minutes if you are able to aspirate easily. And you then 20% of your aspirates, for those who have been doing orbitopalpebral cysts, this is something that comes easily. What you aspirate, you take 20% of that and you calculate the exact volume, and then you divide it 50-50 of bleomycin and lignocaine and inject. The advantage is that you can go up to a volume of 5 ml. So even if you aspirate a lot, you can go up. Now, these are primarily recommended for macrocystic lesions. But of course, even macro plus microcystic are now being done along with admixil, as we'll come to. So the procedure involves the identification of the cyst, which is, and they're all interconnected. So once you get the most anterior and the large one, you'll be able to aspirate the entire thing. Keeping the needle in position, you replace it with the amount of bleomycin and inject it. This was a small video clip, but I personally was not being able to play it. So I'm going to
actually, 1 minute remaining, ma'am.
Yes, I'll be coming, just 2-3 more slides. So this is the second case, which had a significant conjunctival component and a little bit of admixil. Similarly, we had one macrocystic lesion which aspirated the rest. So these are cases which, are easy to do. You have to monitor the vision post-operatively. We give intravenous antibiotics during the surgery and continue it for 2 days and then discharge the patient. However, I also give perioperative intravenous steroids. And I continue the patient for 2 to 4 weeks on oral steroids in a tapering dose. Our imaging is done at 4 weeks in the form of MRI. This is the second case where we had a very defined macrocystic lesion, and she showed an excellent result, just one injection, and she did really well. And this is her at 3 years. So there is a small lesion, but does not have any significant proptosis. And this is just to show that a patient with a microcystic plus admixil. In admixil, the only difference is you have to inject in multiple places, often like you do intralesional steroids for superficial hemangiomas, away from the actual lesion, but actually injecting them in multiple small doses. And this is the kind of response you get. You can go up to, I have gone maximum 4 injections at a period of 6 weeks, but the literature says up to 6 months. Similarly, this one, finally, they have excellent success rate, bleomycin, and I almost do not do debulking unless it's really required. Repeat injections can be done. It's quite economical, and we had a series of about now 14 to 15 patients with a follow-up about 3 to 5 years almost. And in cases where you cannot do this, you have to consider surgical debulking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sauri.
Thank you, ma'am. That was excellent talk. Ma'am, one small question I have is, we all know that sclerosants work very beautifully in this lymphangioma cases. But one case which I saw last month raised a question in my mind. It was treated somewhere else. Patient had a lymphangioma and there was a proptosis, and it was noted that patient has a RAPD also. The other vision maintained was around 624 to 618. And post-injection, proptosis increase or inflammatory reaction increase, and patient lost the whole vision. Like there was already optic neuropathy, but then post-injection it increased for certain reason. The inflammation may be more, and patient went PL negative. Now, I want to ask all the panelists on both the backgrounds, medical backgrounds and the medical legal background, that in such a case that where you have a optic neuropathy, color vision defect, RAPD, and there are chances of loss of vision. So in those cases, the sclerosant is preferable or the surgery, or along with the sclerosant, you will prefer doing a lateral canthotomy at the same time. My question is to all the panelists.
Sabri, you want to take that question?
I'll just add two things which are very important criteria for me. Thanks, Dr. Usha. One is with bleomycin, it's known to cause inflammation. You want to cover with steroids. We give intraoperatively. But I'm very clear about my indications. Unless it's cosmetically so disfiguring, I'm not going to chase eye which is not looking so cosmetically disfigured if there is not a vision involvement. So if there is vision involvement or pupillary involvement, then that's a first criteria. And having said that, you need to choose your cases with a good imaging. And yes, we do counsel the patients that there can be severe inflammation and that there is a small chance of loss of vision. I think my only thing that I want to add last is that though there is a very set criteria and enough literature to prove you can give full dose, I maybe tend to underdose and give it in 2 to 3 injections, especially for a slightly younger age group. Yeah, Dr. Ishan, we like that.
I think that's a very good point. I think the bottom line is counseling. One, we are very sure that we're going to take up cases with compromised vision. So we also need to understand that there's going to be a lot of inflammation. So we can augment with steroids and then probably do the injections and then eventually explain to the patient. But counseling pre-operatively or pre-injection is a mandatory event that we should spend time with the patient explaining the entire scenario and the outcomes as well. I do agree with you, Sabri. Thanks for that. And I think that was a very good compilation of cases and very contextual. So we understand what to do and when to do. Thanks a lot.
Just a small addition, if I can make. So we recently compiled our series and it is now available on PubMed, where we've in our 69 eyes bleomycin sclerotherapy, and the complication that you mentioned of vision loss is something that we've seen in only 2 patients where they didn't lose complete vision. But in retrospect, these patients had mixed vascular malformations. So pre-operative imaging, like Sabri mentioned, is an absolute essential. And I go completely out. I get a Doppler done. I get a CT, MR, angio if required done, to make sure that there isn't any mixed malformation, especially the CAMS spectrum, where you see cerebrofacial metameric syndrome. You're likely to see multiple vascular malformations, and these are the patients which tend to do poorly with sclerotherapy and have a lot of tense orbit post-surgery. So doing a simultaneous canthotomy in such patients is a good idea.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was really helpful. Usha ma'am, you can go ahead with the overview of orbital tumors.
Yeah, I think Dr. Ravindra Mohan is not there, so I will take the next topic. It will be the overview of orbital tumors. Very short time to go through the entire range of tumors, but I'll just quickly run through the common tumors that we come across. Dermoid is the most common tumor that we come across, especially in pediatric age group. You can see that this is a patient with a proptosis, and correspondingly superolaterally you can see a circumscribed tumor, and it is along the suture line. So you obviously know. Here you see a lateral swelling which corresponds to a nicely circumscribed tumor, which is the dermoid. Again, here you can see in the medial aspect there is a prominence, and then you can see a corresponding and well circumscribed tumor. So you can have dermoids at any of the locations. It could be conspicuous or it could be just buried deep in the orbit as well. The next common thing that we come across, especially the neuronal tumors, is the neurofibroma, where you see a nice intraconal lesion, but without any contrast enhancement. And these are very hard tumors, and there is a resistance to retropulsion. And then definitely this needs a wider approach, wherein you might have to do a lateral orbitotomy in the form of a bony osteotomy to be done. And then you can excise these tumors. Here there is a component of visual compromise as well. So you will have to be watchful about the way it progresses, and you will have to immediately remove these tumors. Schwannoma is another condition where we really have a difficulty in approaching these tumors, but you can access it through the lateral approach and excise the tumor in toto, unless it's posteriorly located or towards the apex. Sometimes it's just so cystic, it could burst out, but you will have to remove the tumor in toto in order to make sure that it doesn't recur. And you can always see a prominence with the visual compromise often, and this is when the patients come to us. Coming to neurofibromatosis, I'll have to mention that glioma is the most common association with neurofibromatosis. In a glioma, we often have to resort to either managing it surgically if the vision is completely lost, without removing the eyeball, just excising the tumor. It's a fusiform swelling that you see along the optic nerve. But then in this particular scenario, there is an absence of the roof, and this is a common scenario that we come across, and this needs multiple disciplines to be tackled. And here is another condition, which is a capillary hemangioma here. Though it is a capillary hemangioma, it's a vision threatening situation. So it requires immediate management in the form of intralesional steroids or a combination of intralesional oral steroids or any other drugs that would decrease the size. Sometimes these lesions do not disappear. So you may have to go in for a surgical excision. Coming to the cavernous hemangiomas, these are conditions which are very, very easy to be removed surgically, not often compromising the vision, but sometimes occasionally it can cause occasional blurring of vision, but there is a definite prominence. And these are tumors which can be excised easily through any of the approaches which we'll be discussing in a minute. Meningiomas is always a condition which arises from the optic nerve sheath, and it's very typical on the imaging. You can either track it down on a CT, but MRI is mandatory for us to intervene surgically. And these, sometimes what happens is these conditions cause a visual compromise, not to the extent of a complete vision loss, but in order to preserve the vision, we can sometimes debulk the tumor. What I do is I just shave off the tumor, debulk it. But if the vision is compromised completely, then we'll have to go in for an excision. This is another case of the optic nerve sheath meningioma. Now, the other malignant tumors which could be arising locally are the sarcomas, which we commonly come across in children, or adenocarcinomas from the lacrimal gland, and then retinoblastomas with extensions into the orbit, which are not still very uncommon these days. So this is a rhabdomyosarcoma. After a biopsy, you can treat these patients with either radiotherapy and chemotherapy, and they respond very well. Adenoid cystic carcinomas are a challenge for us to treat. They can start off with the chemotherapy after an incisional biopsy, and or sometimes you can excise it totally and then subject them to radiation. Retinoblastoma actually is a big topic to be dealt with, but there is often an extension into the orbit, and this is, again, I mentioned that it's not a very uncommon scenario in our part of the country. There are other malignant tumors surrounding the orbit, especially from the sinuses. You have frontal, ethmoidal, maxillary tumors extending into the orbit, and then you do have tumors like squamous cell carcinoma, basal cell, sebaceous gland from the lids entering into the orbit, and of course intracranial meningiomas. Here is a case of a sebaceous gland carcinoma which is extended into the orbit. Here is a squamous cell carcinoma, again infiltrating into the orbit, and then you have the sphenoid wing meningioma. And you have mucoceles which can compress the orbit and cause a visual threat as well. So this is a frontal mucocele. You can see the proptosis, the globe being pushed down. Here you have the ethmoidal mucoceles. You can see on either side you have the ethmoidal mucocele compressing the orbit, and it can cause a visual compromise. Rarely the ethmoidal mucoceles cause a visual compromise. It's often the bony tumors which cause a visual compromise, especially this fibrous dysplasia. As you can see in this, there is no evidence of any lesion, but then there is a subtle fullness in this area, and this is disproportionate to what you see on the imaging. Then you have the bony tumors like the osteoid osteomas, which again cause a compression on the optic nerve, which requires immediate intervention in the form of a surgical removal. And then you have very subtle tumors like the maxillary antral tumors, which can just cause a hypertropia. In this particular scenario, if you can see, it's just causing a hypertropia, but then there is a big tumor in the maxillary sinus, which extends into the orbit and requires a surgical clearance. The other tumors like lymphoma, leukemia, and eosinophilic granuloma are quite common. Lymphomas you see in the form of a Salmon patch. It can present as a Salmon patch, or on imaging you will see a lesion which is on palpation. You can see a firm mass. You can palpate a firm mass, and on imaging you can see a lesion that grows along the bony contour, which is very classical of a lymphoma. And this is one scenario which I'd like to place on record, that These are the tumors. Patients come to us anemic, pale, but with proptosis both eyes, and this just requires a peripheral smear, and you'll know that it's a leukemic deposit. And please do not do any biopsy. The mistake that we used to make earlier is do a biopsy, but then now the recommendation is you just have to do a peripheral smear, send the patient to the hemato-oncologist. Now let's look at what we used to do earlier for an adenoid cystic carcinoma. Because it's an adenoid cystic carcinoma, on imaging you get to see a bony defect, and the patient complains of a pain. This was what we used to do earlier, and even now I would advocate this surgical removal, because you need to remove the tumor in toto and also ensure that the bony part is actually provided for histopathological examination when needed. This is another scenario where you do in a case of meningioma, I do a incision, that is a lateral canthal incision, remove the bone, and then excise the tumor. That is, you take out the optic nerve sheath meningioma, and you can see that the tumor can be excised. So it will be probably from behind the globe to the apex. You excise the tumor in toto. You can do it in toto. Sometimes the tumor is so big that you will have to excise it piecemeal, like as I'm doing it right now. And you'll have to ensure a complete removal to ensure that there is no recurrence. That's one portion, and that's the next portion that I'm trying to excise. And you can replace the bone and do the closure. Now this is a very simple approach, where you do an external approach to remove the dermoid. And often you'll have to remove these dermoids in toto, because dermoids have a tendency to recur, and they're more aggressive when they recur. And dermoids definitely require an imaging to make sure that there is no bony erosion or infiltration. So you have to excise it in toto. This is another scenario where you see a patient with elevation deficiency. And this is the imaging which shows a lesion in the superomedial aspect, where you have to excise through the crease incision, and you go in, use blunt instruments to delineate. The surgical plane is very, very important, and ensure that you do not traumatize the surrounding structures. And I like to use this lens spatula, which we used to use for the extracapsular cataract extraction. I'm sure there are a lot available in the old rooms. So you can use that to dissect out very gently and excise the tumor in toto. That's the lesion which that turned out to be a schwannoma. You can see some yellowish granules which are typical, and that can be closed, and the lid crease incision can be comfortably closed.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but yeah, time is running.
Okay, so that's the inferior orbitotomy, where you just have to do a transconjunctival approach. I'm trying to cover Dr. Ravindra Mohan's talk as well, which is a minimally invasive technique. So here you take the transconjunctival approach to excise the cavernous hemangioma. Next one, again, a very minimal incision, small incision, lateral canthal, and you can see the large tumor here just behind the globe, but it just easily slips out and it can be conveniently removed. Again, that's the lesion, and it's a very small incision that we have made in the lateral canthus. Now this is another large tumor. Again, it's encroaching, but you can see that again it can be very easily removed through a canthal approach. This is the last video. I'll be stopping after this. Again, it's a very small incision, but you can remove the tumor in toto, provided you do a complete, very good dissection, and make sure that so it is like a difficult labor, but then these lesions tend to come out very easily. So that's the lesion. I'm going to just skip the thing. So it comes out quite easily, and there's a large lesion which is coming out. That's in toto, it comes out, and that turned out to be a myoperioma. Thank you so much. I think this is all I can cover in this 8 minutes, but I must place on record a huge thanks to Dr. Rahini, Dr. Sumit Lahani sir, and Dr. Santosh, and all the people who have been behind this organizing this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a really beautiful atlas, I can say, of the various orbital tumors and surgical videos. Yeah, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Preeti. We'll be talking on orbital decompression. Dr. Preeti is there? Yeah.
Good evening to all of you. Can you see my slides here?
Yes, yes, they are visible.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me over. At the outset, I'd like to thank Sumit and Dr. Lahane and Ragini ma'am and Santosh sir for having me over and giving me this opportunity. I will be speaking on orbital decompression and what's different in the past few years that we do in this surgery. Now, I have no financial disclosures to make. There are changing trends which we see in indications, the concepts, the surgical tools, as well as there is increasing awareness of fat being the first wall for decompression. Basically, the principle is you expand the orbital space by widening the bony orbit and removal of the excess of fat. So indications are different in the active and inactive stage. In the active stage, most common indication is exposure keratopathy and optic neuropathy, whereas we see more patients now with congestive orbitopathy where the eye looks red but it's not inflamed and the patient has pressure pain because of vascular congestion. The commonest indication that I see in my practice is cosmetically disfiguring proptosis like this patient, and rarely this patient who had lobe luxation 3 episodes before she came to us for decompression. There are some extended indications like craniosynostosis, malar hypoplasia, and some cases where there is unilateral myopia, like in this patient, she had a problem of wearing glasses. The glasses used to rub on the globe. She had ptosis and exotropia because of amblyopia. You can see the huge size of the globe, and she was happy just with a small decompression so that she can wear her glasses comfortably. Now, preoperatively, when you see the imaging, you must distinguish between a fat predominant disease and a muscle predominant disease. You can also do that clinically when you press on the globe. If you have less resistance to retropulsion, you know it is a fat predominant disease, in which case you know that your effect of decompression is better. And also you can retract the globe more easily. The surgery is easier and chances of new onset diplopia is lesser as compared to this kind of a patient with muscle predominant disease. Now, there are several approaches which have been described in the literature, but I would like to just highlight what is commonly used. So we use the skin approach, superior lid please approach for the lateral wall, the inferior conjunctival approach for the inferior wall, and a transcaruncular approach for the medial wall. Now, endoscopic approach I prefer when the orbit is inflamed in the active stage or when the patient has vascular compromise like he's diabetic or a smoker, where you don't want to go transorbitally in order not to have a vascular compromise. Now, there have been various discussions on what wall to decompress, and the decision making is difficult. The general dictum is that each wall causes a 2 millimeter of reduction, but I see that it all depends on the patient's anatomy. If the patient has a lot of fat, then you can have even a 4 or 5 millimeter decompression just with fat decompression. And in some patients, if you have a lot of bone on the lateral wall, a large diploic space, a longer wall, you can have even 5 millimeter to 6 millimeter decompression with the lateral wall. What is generally followed now is when you want a 2 or 3 millimeter proptosis reduction, you can just do fat, which is considered as the first wall for decompression. And when you need a 3 to 6 millimeter reduction, you can add the lateral wall first, then followed by medial wall and then the floor. Now, why we do this is because of the statistics. We see that maximum chances of new onset diplopia is in infiromedial decompression, where the entire muscle cone shifts infiromedially postoperatively and causes new onset diplopia. And it is the least with lateral wall as well as fat decompression. Now, this is one of my older patients where I used to do this kind of an infiromedial decompression, but we used to leave behind this infiromedial strut so that the chances of diplopia are much lesser. Now, this deep lateral wall decompression, the concept was elaborated in the literature by Dr. Goldberg, and that's what I follow. he identified 3 areas of bone in the lateral wall of the orbit, which are thick bones, and decompressing this bone gives a good a decompressive effect. So he described them as the lacrimal keyhole, the basin of the sphenoid bone, as well as, the door jamb of the sphenoid and the basin of the inferior orbital fissure. And you can achieve up to a 5 to 6 millimeter reduction if you do the complete decompression of the lateral wall. So I'll now go through my patients. This is one of the patients who came to us with cosmetically disfiguring proptosis. You can see she has a fat predominant disease. She's also a high myope. She has good thickness of the lateral wall. And whenever you see patients scanned preoperatively, you must see the location of the cripiform plate, the location of the fovea ethmoidalis, because your anterior cerebral artery lies just there, and also the aeration of the sinuses, and also the location of drainage of the maxillary sinus, which is usually in the anterior part of the inferior-medial strut. So if you compromise on the anterior part of the inferior-medial strut, we find that the maxillary sinus drainage gets affected and the patient has chronic sinusitis, and sometimes the orbit implodes, causing a future enophthalmos. So the preoperative assessment of coronal scans is very, very important. Now in this patient, we see that she had a fat predominant disease. So I decided to do a 3-wall decompression because she had also a hyperopia and I wanted the globe to come down a little bit. So I choose a superior lid crease approach for the deep lateral wall decompression. The incision is made on the skin crease and then the dissection is done up to the periosteum. I am incising on the subbrow fat now to reach the periosteum. Now the periosteum should be exposed right from the supraorbital canal to the lateral canthus. That wide an exposure you need to access the orbit. And the periosteum is incised about 4 to 5 millimeter from the orbital margin like this. And then the periosteum should be lifted atraumatically in such a way so that you don't have premature expulsion of the orbital fat. So once the exposure is good, you start creating the lacrimal keyhole with a high-speed cutting drill. Now this creates a nice socket or a space for the lacrimal gland to then settle inside the orbit. And it also gives you some good access into the orbit to go into the deeper areas like the superior orbital fissure. Now, once you enter and make this lacrimal keyhole, you move towards the superior orbital fissure. Now, this is the lateral wall where you can go full thickness, you leave behind the rim and you can reach up to the temporalis fascia and you can even open the temporalis fascia. Now I'm going to go to the sphenoid door jamb, that is the thick bone in the greater wing of the sphenoid. And you can see once that is done, such a big area is created and this can give you a very good decompression. Now I use a bone wax mostly to control the diploic space bleeding, and you can see the change in the bone direction once you reach the superior orbital fissure, wherein I start using the diamond drill then. And here I am now removing the bone in front of the temporalis fascia. Once that is done, the periosteum is opened and then the fat decompression is done. Superolaterally, you should be careful not to damage the ciliary ganglion, otherwise you will have pupillary dilatation. Now coming to the medial wall, you do a transcaruncular approach. You can see that I have taken almost 10 to 12 millimeter incision. And then you go and enter posterior to the posterior lacrimal crest so that you don't damage the lacrimal apparatus. And I like to make the first opening right posteriorly at the posteriormost edge of the thin bone so that you can then come anteriorly with your rongeurs. And this bleeds a lot because the sinus mucosa bleeds. You must make sure that you remove all the sinus mucosa to control the bleeding. You must not go superior to the frontoethmoid suture, otherwise you will have intracranial complications. And you remove all the bone right from the attachment of the hormus muscle anteriorly to posteriorly right in front of the annulus of Zinn. Now we leave the posterior part of the inferior-medial, no, you can remove the posterior part of the inferior-medial strut. The anterior 10 to 11 millimeter is left behind. Once you remove the posterior part of the strut, you have a further decompression effect. Now I'm opening the periosteum, and I'll show you the technique of fat decompression. Here I'm doing it under direct visualization under a microscope. So you can see all the vessels very clearly. And I first open up the septa in between the fat and then just suck with a suction tip and keep cutting as the fat comes out. a lot of fat I see in the medial orbit, and I like to remove a lot of fat from the medial orbit also, in addition to the inferolateral traditional approach.
Preeti, 1 minute is remaining.
Yes. And now we go on to the floor. I'm doing a swinging eyelid approach, and you reach the inferior orbital brim. Now, in this patient, since I want the eyeball to come down, I'm removing some of the anterior bone also. Otherwise, at least 10 millimeter of bone, the anterior part of the floor should be left behind. You put your suction tip right up to the posterior maxillary wall, lift the bone so that you do a complete decompression up to the palatine bone. And many surgeons remove the palatine bone also with a chisel and hammer. Now, I do not deroof the infraorbital canal because it causes paresthesia. So that is the infraorbital nerve, and that is left behind. And then you move on to the basin of the inferiorbital fissure, which is the zygoma in anterior to the inferiorbital fissure. So this is the content of the inferiorbital fissure. I go anterior to that, and you will reach the buccal fat as well as the maxillary sinus mucosa. So you can see that this patient improved beautifully, and her hyperglobus is also corrected. The lower lid retraction is corrected, and we achieved a 10 millimeter reduction in proptosis. Now, this patient who had a luxation of globe also, here she has a very well aerated sinus, and she has huge amount of fat in the orbit. And so I decided to do only a 2-wall decompression along with fat. And you can see 11 millimeter of proptosis reduction just with that surgery. She's 1 week post-op here, just after suture removal, and she has a tremendous improvement. Now, recent technology involves use of navigation as well as pneumatic drill. Navigation helps you in the initial phases to learn, I would say, the anatomy, because you know exactly what are the structures. You can identify them during the surgery. You know exactly how much bone is left behind. Otherwise, it does not add any further advantage, but it is a very useful learning tool. And now we have the ultrasonic aspirator, which is just like the phacoprobe, wherein you have the irrigation and it uses ultrasonic energy, which is much safer, and it safeguards your soft tissue. So this is the ultrasonic aspirator. And you can achieve a very good decompression. However, it is expensive instrument, but it is safe in the hand in the earlier cases when you're learning. And it gives you a good visualization because you have irrigation along with your cutting. And here I'm using navigation along with the ultrasonic aspirator. So these were the 2 new technologies that are used in decompression. And these are some of my patients. Some of the pictures have been sent by patients, so they are not comparable, but they have achieved a good reduction in proptosis. So to summarize, we have discussed the changing indications in orbital decompression. We see more of cosmetic decompressions now. There have been changing trends in the number of walls of decompression, and the fat decompression being considered as the first wall. And there has been some advancement in surgical tools, in visualization and use of microscope. Thank you very much for your kind hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. That was very extensive and wonderful talk about decompression. Any comments or questions from panelists?
Do we have time to just discuss?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. As for imaging, it's
along with the and the tracking of the central point of fitness is a great tool for following up on before and after cataracts.
तुम्हाला म्यूट करावं लागेल
because the cell count tends to be erroneous when there is a lot of.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so no, the question, I mean, for the imaging, it was an excellent overview actually we had from Raksha. But one point to be emphasized is the foreign bodies. Foreign bodies, we often tend to take a CT scan. And what we need to remember is in CT, when there is a foreign body, especially a wooden foreign body, it cannot be just one time. It has to be a sequential imaging. And it's often to be associated with the clinical findings. There's often a sinus, there's a fistula, there's pus pouring from there. So that part has to be emphasized. I think that's something that we need to remember. And a question to Tarjini was, in case of dermis fat graft, have you come across fat hypertrophy, especially in children?
I'm not
Not so much, ma'am. I've seen more melts than hypertrophy actually in dermis fat graft, to be very frank. So not really a lot of hypertrophy in children. And as it is as a sort of a protocol for most children here, most of the pediatric cases would be in enucleation. And as a protocol at LVPI, we've been following the placement of a PMMA implant. So not many cases of pediatric DFGs that I have on my list.
Okay, this is mainly for patients who've not had a primary implant, and those patients come and we end up doing a dermis fat graft, and sometimes we do see the fat hypertrophy, in which case we'll have to go and revise, I think. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. The other question that I was also having for you is, in case of multiple surgeries, what is your, see, the patient comes to you with multiple surgeries, having done elsewhere whatsoever. What's your first choice in a contracted socket?
I generally tend to assess them based on surface and volume. And whatever is the missing element, I sort of tend to address that. Now, having said that, if there are multiple socket surgeries done for surface augmentation, that's the situation where you would have a lot of contracted socket. I try to be very minimalistic. Whatever little bit I can do to sort of enhance by the use of fillers or probably some eyelid interventions like hard palate mucosal grafts to correct that severe entropion that is also there with contracted socket and optical illusions with glasses. I'd sort of go with a combination of these things rather than put my hands in a socket which has been operated many times.
Yeah, Tarjini, having said that, I was just wondering, because you have been working a lot on these sockets. So my question to you, just for us to feel better, all the panelists and the listeners to feel better, what percentage of cases have you given up saying that, no, I'm not going to do anything further with this socket and have a spectacle mounted prosthesis or whatsoever?
That would be a very small percentage. I've definitely tried doing some intervention or the other. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the use of a 5-FU and a steroid cocktail, which I would like very much pre-surgery in such severely contracted sockets.
Wonderful. So which means all of us have to work harder to achieve that. The other important aspect I wanted to highlight when the blowout fracture was, there was a mention about the sections. It has to be axial, sagittal and coronal views we need to have. And the size of the cuts also have to be more refined, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if, I don't remember whether he mentioned about it, but I think we need to have all three views, the axial, coronal and the sagittal, as far as the fractures, injuries or foreign bodies are concerned. I think we need to have that in place. So now coming to Mucor, I think that's the buzzword now. I mean, we are not sure, we are not seeing that many here. Probably we are not facing that kind of a crisis yet, and we are not far away from it. We are in the southernmost part, so we still haven't got so many. But what I understand is it is reassuring. Both Sabri and Moreka were saying that it is not so bad in terms of treatment. But I just like to question Dr. Sabri about, why don't you prefer the retrobulbar amphotericin? Or did I miss it? Or did you?
From last year, what we saw from when it all started, and I probably Sunil and a lot of Ramesh and all, and even Dr. Lahane, they've all been seeing a lot of these. I think even Mangesh, we've all been seeing, sorry, even Tarjani, we are actually all working on it. The thing is that last year's Mucor was a whole different ball game. We were seeing the age group was 45, 50 plus. It was coming very traditionally, sinuses, orbits, doing its usual thing that it does, but post-COVID. This one is, I mean, like I just jokingly, but very sadly said to someone, it's almost like it's taken on an alien morphological thing, and it presents sometimes in orbit, no sinuses, sometimes in the sinuses, right in the ethmoids. So when we are dealing with this, what has evolved over the last 2 years, I think for a lot of us working here is that, yes, you can't end up exenterating. Also, the age group has shifted from 45, 50 plus to 20 to 35-year-olds, which is, I mean, it's distressing to have to exenterate, people who are just like about to start their life and are going to be bread earners of the family. So now retrospectively, as we're going over the data, we are realizing that you don't want to exenterate. There are certain parameters. Tarjani is putting a whole big data together. which you're trying to publish, which is we're trying to go back and say that, okay, so anterior orbit, mid orbit with maybe medial rectus, inferior rectus, don't need to exenterate like we used to think. Orbital fat stranding, not need to necessarily exenterate. Conventional amphotericin B maybe does not work, but unfortunately, people cannot afford liposomal. But liposomal is the way to go, and systemic does hold off a lot of the orbital involvement. So it's not that we aren't doing it, but I think with retroorbital amphotericin B, we're just figuring out which cases are going to work, because I, for one, actually questioned this very same thing when we were having a discussion with our team in the hospital, that why can't we just be bold and give each and every patient who comes with orbital involvement? But somebody has to be ready to bell that cat. And I guess we have to put our heads together and come with certain parameters, say that you can, because if we say it's okay, I feel we are going to may just let out a different element altogether.
But then since you're seeing a lot of it, I think Tarjini and you probably would be seeing, I don't know, the rest of the panel is also here, would be seeing a lot of it. So probably you should do something about.
Ramesh just told me yesterday he's seen 70 cases.
Who is this?
Ramesh.
Oh my, oh.
He is also quite seeing a lot in JJ. Sunil is seeing, I'm sure Mangesh must be also seeing, because for some reason from the central part of Maharashtra, we are seeing a lot of them.
Right, okay. So I think you should put it on paper as to how to go about, because you have the maximum number of cases and you can pull in and say, and we are not very far from it. Cases are on the increase and we are having a lot of
I hope not.
Crossing fingers, but we'll have to face that reality. So you mean to say you're still on the trial about the retrobulbar amphotericin?
I'm giving it, we are giving it, but we've only recently started giving it. Tarjini has already tried. I assume Sunil has also tried. Ramesh, I think, has tried. Okay. I've given 2 to 3 cases. I'm scheduled to actually give 2 more tomorrow.
Okay.
But these people have already started trying them.
Okay.
I think.
Thank you. I think that's a very useful tip for us. Yeah.
Sunil sir, want to say something? Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Sunil,
you need to unmute yourself.
I'd like to add a couple of things here. My first exenteration I had done under Dr. Lahane in 1998. So Lahane sir had said, Sunil, you will have to do this someday or the other. These things are going to come back. And they're going to be there because people are using antibiotics and antifungals left, right, and center. So he was almost prophetic when he said that in 1998. Today जाऊन हे भरपूर येणार आहे. So that is called far-sightedness. And from there to this, I mean, Sumit's paper is excellent, which has been published in the IGO. He's analyzed the whole thing, so I was very happy about it. There are 2 points that I wanted to note here, is that most of these patients of corona right now are coming with an acute kidney injury. And what is happening is that most of them have a hypoproteinemia, because in the injury you get proteinuria. Now, when proteinuria occurs, your creatinine and BUN will not rise. So you have to see your cystatin C. So you see a cystatin C clearance ratio, and then you'll realize that this patient is in renal damage even before your creatinine and albumin and BUN shows abnormality. In such cases, to give the liposomal amphotericin intravenous, or to give it as a systemic condition for something which is local, does not make sense. If you can give it locally, you give a bolus locally, it makes a whole of a lot of sense. The second thing is that most of these patients are coming with polymicrobial infections. So they are in the ICU. So they have Enterococcus faecalis in their urine. They have got Candida auris in their urine. Their tracheal cultures are gram-negative ELDS producers. So my ex-wife used to be microbiology. She is a person who's dealt with Clostridium difficile infections, drug-resistant, as well as extended spectrum beta-lactamase producers. Now what happens is that because of this, these patients have already got a lot of antibiotics. They've got a lot of antibiotics. Their kidneys have already been fired by this, and then they come to us with mucor. You just don't have a chance to give a systemic antifungal. Now, for that reason, the isavuconazole is something like a step down. So the amphotericin doesn't causes a lot of side effects. The isavuconazole does not. Secondly, that rescue, I mean, if it is not sensitive to amphotericin, the isavuconazole is somehow sensitive. So amphotericin reserved for a local this thing makes a lot of sense. Besides this, when you look at COVID, there are multiple aspects in COVID. I mean, having done 1000 CME credit hours, I mean, this is again thanks to Lahane sir. I mean, he and me used to sit and read Duke Elders 14 volumes 3 times over my 3 years I've read with him. So this has become a habit that till 3 o'clock in the night, I'm doing 1000 CMEs over the last 1.5 years. Now, when you look at various aspects, the heart is involved. So you have an electrolyte imbalance. You have a kidney involvement. So the heart is involved because an organ crosstalk. And then you have electrolyte imbalance. So when you consider all of these together, the patients have this thing. In fact, me, I didn't get COVID, but my heart rate was 22. I mean, for 2 days, my heart rate was 22. And I wrote to my friends and all, this, bye boss, this is like 22. I mean, this is incompatible with life. And then I just added up steroid. My ECG is low volume, low voltage. So you correct your electrolytes and everything is fine. So giving amphotericin destroys your kidney, and again your electrolyte imbalance comes in. So dealing with this in that aspect, a local treatment, if you can focus more on local, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a whole lot of sense. And the amount of success that we've got, I mean, with treating this locally, we'll have to publish this very fast. I was suggesting to Akshay that the whole group get together, make it a national group, make it a mucormycosis study. Savri muted. Make it a national study, and we'll tell people.
I think the main thing is that it's systemic plus local. Let's not deviate from.
Yes. See, the whole point is what you can somehow have a pulmonary aspergillosis and not mucor. You will have a urinary candidiasis where you need a voriconazole, and voriconazole is doesn't work with this thing, or you can need a mycofungin. So you want to give amphotericin systemically where you actually need mycofungin or voriconazole. I mean, everything goes haywire. So what we've done is in which there is bladder involvement, you give betadine washes and the Candida auris is gone.
Yeah, still I think it's very well argued. Both of you have a point to make. I think some of the cases it really suits doing a systemic, and some of them are very specific.
Yes, tailor-made.
Thanks for that. It really helps us, and we can now be prepared to deal with cases. Thank you so much. I think it's very good that you put forward your presentation. It's really opening eyes, and Sabri, we take your point as well. I think it's very clear.
I have to thank Dr. Lahane for this. I hope he says a couple of words.
Ma'am, can I ask one question? Yeah. Ma'am, do we have some kind of protection in Tamil Nadu? We don't have that many cases. At least
exactly. The temperature, or I don't know, it's wild. The weather is very, very chaotic.
Yes.
We had rains this morning. It was so hot early in the morning, and mid-morning it was raining heavily. Maybe it's been washed off. I don't know, but we thankfully are not seeing so many mucors. But
we're not seeing so many.
This presentation is really helpful for us. I know. I think we'll all have to be prepared. And Preeti is more closer towards. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, Lahane sir, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, and everybody who have taken part in this, and I'm very happy, Sunil, everybody who has really presented very well, and I was listening to all the presentation, because one time I was an oculoplastic surgeon, but because of Sumit, now I am not oculoplastic surgeon. He has removed me. Just now, whenever the patient comes, I say the refer to Sumit. So I think thank you very much, and I appreciate the efforts of Sumit and Dr. Ragini, the Swapnesh, and Dr. this all Pritham. So they have done, and also the Parikshit. So they have done wonderful job, and I think this is the last session in oculoplasty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Chloe. Actually, we're really happy to have it. Sumit, he's handed over to the right hands. You've been a fantastic session. Thank you all. We all enjoyed it.
Asking people to keep to time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.